resistance movement are all reluctant, or have been reluctant, to talk about what happened, because a lot of stuff went on that they don't want people really to know about it. And there were certain instances that I'll tell about that happened to our family, so we know about them because we were there, and there were other instances because there was injuries and deaths involved. So we learned about a lot of these things, and I try to put it in a story that makes some sense, but it's a little difficult to get all the accuracy. So some of it may be a little bit in order to make the story sound better. But anyway, in the 30s, my parents were married, early 30s, and they moved to Indonesia as missionaries. They moved back after 5 years, moved back to Holland. Their intention was to go back to Indonesia, but there was some bad stuff happening in the late 30s. And on May 10th of 1940, the German blitzkrieg over Holland, and it took them 3 days to capture the whole country. They had all the stukas, and they had all the fancy stuff, and they were going to have it localized, and all the concerts and stuff. They moved really fast to go the whole country.
All the who?
The concert.
Okay.
Yeah, concert. My dad at the time, when he was back at a job as the principal of a school in a relatively small town way up north. They're only about 20 miles from the German border up there. And because it's a small town, it was this one school covered all the grades. And the Germans came in, and they immediately grabbed that school as a barracks for their soldiers. So they kicked him out, and he got kind of pissed about that. And then they found out that some of the people that he knew were Jewish, and they were being rounded up and taken to the train station and put in boxcars and sent off. And so he didn't think that was a very nice thing to do. So he started getting actively helping them escape. And we, at one time or another, had anywhere from one person to a family in the attic of our house. Jewish people waiting to be taken out. They were usually sent off to England or to Finland, which was another neutral country at that time. Sweden was people too, but the Germans were much more active over there. So he did that for a while, and then he became more and more involved with the resistance movement itself. He got injured. They had an old car that they had taken the doors off. They'd take the doors off the car so they can get out fast. And they would transport anything from people to foodstuffs or ammunition and try and get it past the German guards and stuff. Apparently, one time they had to deliver some munitions, and somebody tattled on them, and the Germans were ready for the car coming there. And they got closer to destination, and there was machine gun fire, and the driver was killed, and the hand grenades were thrown, and the one hand grenade fell in the car, blew my dad right out of the car because there was no door, and into a ditch. Now, I'm not sure, there's two stories there. One is that there was water in the ditch. My dad was unconscious when he went in there, fell in the water, the cold water revived him. The other one is that he stayed conscious the whole time. There was no water, but it's more or less the same stuff. He and one other survivor managed to crawl away to a local farmer they knew was a friendly farmer, and the farmer hid him out until they could get him moved away. Now, all these maneuvers that they did with carrying munitions and what have you was not done ad hoc. It was not done just, hey, I think I'll move some shit. It came mostly from England because the Dutch government escaped during the Blitzkrieg to England. They were actively working in Holland, and they directed what went on with the underground, pretty well through the BBC over there. The BBC would have a broadcast several nights a week, and you'd hear weird statements like, Mary fell over the dog, the car didn't start today, all these totally nonsense statements, but they were all codes to different groups of the resistance fighters. The Germans never could capture what that code was because it wasn't a code, it was something strictly between one person or another. So what the Germans did, they said, we're going to make it illegal to have a radio to receive the BBC. Any radio you bought in the 20s, 30s, 40s back in Europe would get the BBC. So that means all radios. If you had a radio, that was illegal. The solution was very simple. If you had a radio in your house, the whole family was sent to a concentration camp. So that was pretty tough. My dad became very well known amongst the Germans as a leader. You gotta remember, my dad was the principal of a big school for that city. And in those days, in the 40s, the principal of the school was an important person, so he by default became the leader. And so the Germans put out they wanted him, and they put him on one of the most wanted people in the northern Holland. My dad had a radio, and what he had a two-story house with an attic where we kept Jewish people. But below there, at the stairway coming down upstairs, there was a bit of a landing, and he'd taken that thing and made it into a trapdoor. And underneath that trapdoor, he had a radio. He also hid all the silverware that we had, and anything silver that we had, because silver was very popular with the Germans for armament, for ammunitions and things like that. And so it had a trapdoor at the bottom of the stairs, and it had a carpet over top. I get emotional about this part, so they had a carpet laying on top of the trapdoor. Well, the Germans were pissed because they couldn't find my dad. He was hiding all the time, so they occupied our house. And so there's my mother with 4 kids, and all the Nazi Germans hanging in the house. And one of the months, and my mother got very pissed for another reason. She had to go to the bathroom, and they wouldn't let her go unless somebody went with her. You know, the morality at that time was a little different, and having somebody else there was really a nasty thing. Anyway, the German walked down the stairs, and when he got to the bottom, he went like this. Something doesn't sound right over here. So he lifted the carpet, saw the trap door, lifted it up, saw the radio, and my mother was terrible shape at this time because this is concentration camp for the whole family, kids, everybody. The German looked at the radio, looked at my mother, and winked at her, turned it back down again. Sorry, I get emotional with that because that's how close I was to not being here. Anyway, so they weren't all bad. Shortly after this, the Allies started coming into Europe. They had the invasion of Normandy and all that kind of stuff. In northern Holland, it was mostly Canadian troops. And there was a big artillery company that was based close to where we were. Now, my dad, being from the area and had been in the underground, knew a lot of things going on, so he aligned himself with the Canadian artillery. And the artillery manager there, the captain there was a Captain Wilford, and they got to be really good friends. And my dad's job was to help find targets for them and things of that nature. And they became really good friends. And Mr. Wilford came from an old town called Souk, which is on the west coast of Vancouver Island. He owned a rather large farm, which used to be a hotel. Somebody built a hotel in the 1890s. It was an eight room hotel, and it was empty. And so he said to my dad, listen, look around you, everything's bombed to shit out here. This is no place to be. You should come to me, I'm a turkey farmer. You can come over here and farm turkeys with me. But that's a good life. And my dad thought, oh, that's probably true. So here's a guy who's well educated. He's got a job. At that time he became the Minister of Education in Holland, and we moved to The Hague for that. And
Gary, can you hear okay? Can you hear okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm good.
I just want to make sure you can hear.
Okay.
Even though I'm deaf from both ears.
I just scoot up closer.
So my dad decided, yeah, that's probably a good idea. And so in 1950, we all immigrated to Canada. And we had the whole history of Canada and Indonesia and all that kind of stuff. And I won't go much into that story because we weren't there but a month or two, and my dad had a serious heart attack, so our whole family life changed again. But that gives you a pretty good indication of the kind of stuff that my parents had to go through, and things that were pretty darn tough. And I brought a couple of these pictures, but the one picture I did want to show, this picture, and I'll pass it around, is when we landed in Victoria to go to Souk, and the guy on the right with the mustache is Captain Wilford, and he was the captain of the Canadian artillery. All the Canadian, you know, we talk about how we liberated the country and everything else. It was a good thing, right? But I have an aunt, not alive anymore, who hated Canadians because she got raped. He got raped by one of the Canadian soldiers. Because that kind of shit happens, you know? So you have to balance everything off sometimes a little bit. But it was a tough time. Food was really scarce. Because we were all the way in northern Holland, it was mostly farm country. They had, we had reasonable food, but not much. Everybody that's born and lives there got ration cards. And this was my ration card for me, because everybody as a baby, I got one of these things too, that has notifications of stuff that we can have. I'll pass these
Are
around.
these from the Nazis or from the government that was in charge?
It's essentially from the Nazis. What the Germans did, they would find people who were willing to work with them. And they call them NSB in Dutch, which stands for National Socialist Citizens, if you will. And they would work in the offices and that kind of stuff. After the war, these people were all hunted down and prosecuted. In some cases were killed. Some of these people were worse than the Germans. So these cards are in Dutch. They're from the Kingdom of Holland, but they were done by the Nazis. That's where these came from. There were incidents of people in places like Amsterdam, where there was a high population and not much growing there, when people would push a hand cart for 100 miles to a farm to find some food, push the hand cart back, and halfway back, get accosted by a German soldier and take all the food. Nothing. There was severe bombing going on. For myself, I've been told that when up until a year or two after the war, if an airplane went overhead, I would crawl underneath the table and yell "Auto boom boom, auto boom boom," like car noise of bombs, you know. So as a kid would do. So it was pretty bad, but we had it pretty easy. If we would have been in Rotterdam was flattened by both the Germans and by the Americans and the English. It was flattened because it was a major port. And one of the things that the Germans did, which everybody was very much against, they used a lot of phosphor bombs. And if you're familiar with phosphor bombs, the people that got phosphor on them had burning material on their skin and it stuck. So they'd jump in the water, it would turn the fire off, but as soon as they got back out in the air, it would catch fire again by itself, self-ignite, and it was really nasty. Rotterdam today is a nice city to visit. The whole downtown has been rebuilt. All the architecture, except one big church, has been totally redone. So, the country of Holland has recovered from all this kind of crap. But anyway, my dad died fairly early, and I was drafted, which is why I was in the military there. It wasn't a choice.
So you returned from Canada?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, my dad had, at that time it's called Harding's arteries. And it was known that people that had Harding's arteries were always wanting something else. My dad always wanted to have something different. So we moved to Canada where he had a heart attack. My two oldest brothers, they had to start working in the sawmill to make money to make the place meat. But what I forgot to say, because my dad was injured, and after the war they were still pulling shrapnel out of his body. He got a lifetime pension from the Dutch organization of 4045, and there's a book about organization. This is all in Dutch, but there's pictures of it too. He got a pension from that, but he always thought he wanted something else. There was a big demand for teachers in Holland, but not enough housing for anybody. So that they would attract people by saying, I have an apartment available for you if you come teach over here. So my dad said, I'll go back. So we went back, and he went back there for 6 or 7 months, and he said, oh shit, I don't like this. I'm going back. And so he still owns a house in Canada. So we go back to Canada. The 4 of us, my mother, my dad, my sister, and myself, moved back to Canada. We'd be back there for a year or so, and he said, well, you know, it really was better in Holland, and we go back again. The only reason this has any significance at all is that my permanent address was in Vancouver, British Columbia. When I was drafted, my permanent address was Vancouver, British Columbia. I didn't know this had any effect on anything at the time. But I started looking at it and it says, hey, everybody gets a week off every 2 weeks, or a long weekend off every 2 weeks. what does this mean for me if I'm from out of the country? So I looked it up, and the law says if you were drafted from a foreign country, every 5 weeks you're allowed 1 week at home, exclusive of travel time. Travel will be the cheapest way. So I found the cheapest way to do this was to take the boat from Rotterdam to Montreal, which was about 10 days, then a 4-day train from Montreal to Vancouver. I'd be home a week, and then I'd take the train back to Montreal, and then take the boat back to Rotterdam, say, I'm back, and by the way, my next flight is tomorrow, my next boat is tomorrow again, so they just said, well, maybe you just want to get out. And since I was a draftee, unlike you guys who went in on your own, I was a draftee, I said, yeah, I'll leave. So that's how I got out of the Army.
Yeah, you spent all your time on vacation.
Yeah.
I would have.
They never saw you.
I would have, that would have happened, but the other part which is important for us is that my total time, I was obligated to spend 24 months because I was an NCO, but I got out after 19 months. Hey, cool. So now I moved to the United States, Ramon and I got married, and there's this thing called Vietnam going on. And I said, what's your birthday? Okay, hey, wait a minute. But the law says that if you serve more than 18 consecutive months in the NATO force, you are considered to have done your service. So Ramon, I said, phew.
What year was you in?
I was drafted in 1962 and got out in 1964.
Oh.
So,
I joined the service in '53
53.
and got out in '57. I spent 3 years in Germany,
Really?
on the western part of Germany and the eastern part of France, and I was in NATO.
Mm-hmm.
And we set up microwave communication before it was all on VHF. And anyway, that's, I even got to go to Siemens factory, and I was spending 2 weeks there learning their microwave.
No. That was an interesting time.
where was your dad hiding?
My dad was hiding with local other people in different houses.
So he just kind of went from place
He went place to place. My oldest brother, Chris, he was 11 at that time, and therefore of no real concern to the Germans. My mother said, Chris, you've got to go out and go to farmer so-and-so, who's part of the resistance, to tell your dad not to come home. And that's how he came to not come home, because they were waiting for him there. But it was a pretty tough time over there because the rationing, everything's going, and the fighting. One of the things, if you go, let me rephrase that a little bit. My dad, one thing that always bothered my dad was that there was a small town not far from where we lived that had population was about 500, and some of the resistance fighters got into a firefight with some of the Nazi soldiers, and they killed a high-ranking officer, and that was near a small town. So the Germans got really pissed about the fact that the resistance had killed one of the top-ranking officers. So they went into the town and they killed every male. 1 week old, 2 years old, 80 years old, they're male, they killed, shot them on the spot. And I know about this. If you look it up on Wikipedia, they tell you it did not happen. But I can tell you this, my dad took me back to this town afterwards because he was very upset because he was the leader. And he took me to this town, and there's a statue in the center of the town of a bunch of women standing around in a semicircle, all crying, because every male was killed.
Well, Wikipedia has well known for its bullshit.
Yeah, yeah. You know,
Sorry about that.
But I know because my dad took me and he showed me the statue and he told me the story, and I know that he was, one of the few things he told us about the resistance because it upset him, because he felt indirectly responsible because he was the leader of the resistance up there, and that bothered him a lot. I don't know how many males were killed because most of the males were already gone anyway, but nevertheless, I mean, he started killing every child.
Sounds like what Aaron tried to do in the Bible to get the, killed all the males.
Biggest he was a leader,
Yeah.
he probably knew a lot of the males that were killed.
Probably did, yes. He also knew a lot of the Jews, at least at the beginning, that he helped escape because they all lived in the same area. And before the war started, he didn't think about this guy's a Jew.
Yeah.
What, I mean, who cares? You know, incidental. But then once he started wearing that star,
Yeah.
and they started being put into the railroad cars and being shipped off, it was a totally different story.
Well, it sure seems like they care today who's a Jew and
Yeah.
they don't put a stop to that stuff, and that's one of the things that has me worried. Exactly what you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Well, there's no end to the hostilities. It doesn't matter, you know, we always talk about peace and this kind of stuff, but you cannot find a time in history. I've tried to find a time in history when we had 100 years, 50 years without a war. There's always a war.
Yeah.
We may not think about it, but we had World War II, and then we had the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War, Afghanistan, we had
The Cold War in between all that.
yeah, if we weren't actively fighting, I brought my dad's driver's license, I think. Anyway, we lived in a street, and I'll say it in Dutch and I'll translate it. The street name we lived on was Verzetstrijders-Laan. It translated, it means Resistance Fighters Lane. And that's what we lived on, and we didn't really think about it. But when my dad was buried, somebody came up, we didn't know, and eulogized my dad, and he commented about the fact that he lived on that resistance fighter lane because that's what his history was. We never knew who it was until afterwards somebody went up and apparently they fought together.
Can't imagine.
And I was in charge of 20 trucks and 1 Jeep. And we were stationed to move to a city called Zwolle, which is in the middle of the country, because it was 15, 20 miles away from a brand new Bomark missile site. Remember the Bomark missiles? They were a big deal. They're going to be the one thing that's going to win the Cold War. The Bomark missile site was top secret classified stuff. And my duty was to be ready to transport if something went on that they needed transport. So my job was transport. And the way they set it up, that the Bomark missile was underground in the bunker. And then they had the supporting buildings around it, and then they had the fence. And inside the fence, American MPs with dogs patrol. Outside of that was another fence. And they had Dutch MPs with dogs patrolled around there. And there was another fence around there, and Dutch guard troops walked around their garden, because this is really a secret base. The only way we had a map to get there was a hand-drawn map, a piece of pencil, and said, okay, this is where you gotta go. And the thing that we had to do was, 5 of my drivers were on super standby. Super standby meant that they had all their gear in the truck, and they stayed with the truck. The 15 of us were close by and were on standby, and we were ready to move in 5 minutes. So one day they called an alarm for us for a standby for a test. We didn't even know it was a test. They said, okay, we're gonna have, you got an alarm. And so the first 5 guys took off. And they got in that Jeep, and and hell, you know, I mean, they had the excuse to drive as fast as they possibly could. I was about 5 minutes behind them with the rest of the 15 trucks. I was in the front truck, and I got there and I said, holy shit. There was this base and all the gates were closed, and my 5 trucks were inside the gates, and the Americans competed with dogs, and all the drivers were standing there like this. Nobody told the Americans that we were gonna have an exercise, So these guys are sitting there with the bomber missile site and the secure stuff, sitting around wondering what they're gonna do that day, and all of a sudden 5 trucks come zooming in there at high speed, you know? That was really kind of funny.
Sounds like the Secret Service today.
Oh.